The first tremor started in my fingertips during calculus class, a barely perceptible quiver that I pressed flat against my desk, hoping no one would notice. Maya Chen had always been the steady one, the reliable daughter who never caused trouble, who managed. But as I stared at the equations blurring on the whiteboard, my vision swimming like I was looking through water, I knew something was terribly wrong. My phone buzzed against my thigh, a glucose monitor alert I'd been dreading. The number glowed angry red, 45 milligrams per deciliter. Dangerously low. My hands shook as I reached for my emergency glucose tablets, only to find an empty container rattling mockingly in my backpack. Panic crept up my throat like ice water. I'd been rationing my insulin for 3 days now, stretching each precious drop because my parents had promised, sworn, they'd refill my prescription this morning. "Ms. Chen, are you all right?" Mrs. Rodriguez's voice seemed to echo from a great distance. The classroom tilted slightly, and I gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles went white. "I need to go to the nurse," I whispered, but even those few words felt like running a marathon. My classmates' faces turned toward me, concern flickering in their eyes, but I couldn't focus on any of them. The world was becoming a watercolor painting left in the rain. If you've ever dealt with a medical emergency like this, you know how terrifying those moments can be. If this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like and share it so other families know they're not alone. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, fluorescent lights stabbing at my retinas like tiny suns. Each step felt like walking through quicksand, my legs heavy and unresponsive. Other students moved past me in slow motion, their voices muffled and distorted. I pressed my shoulder against the cool brick wall for support, leaving a damp trail of sweat in my wake. "Maya!" Someone called my name, but it sounded like they were shouting through cotton. I turned, nearly losing my balance, to see Jordan Martinez jogging toward me. We'd been lab partners in chemistry since freshman year, and he knew about my diabetes, had even helped me through a mild episode once during a particularly stressful exam week. "You're having a reaction," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. His usually playful demeanor had vanished, replaced with focused determination. "Where's your emergency kit?" "Empty," I managed, leaning heavily against him as he wrapped an arm around my waist. "Parents were supposed to... this morning." His jaw tightened, but he didn't waste time on questions. Instead, he half-carried me toward the main office, his sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum. "Mrs. Patterson," he called out as we stumbled through the door, "Maya needs help. Severe hypoglycemic episode." The school secretary, a woman who had dealt with everything from broken bones to panic attacks, took one look at me and grabbed the emergency glucose gel from the first aid station. Her movements were swift and practiced as she tore open the packet. "Honey, I need you to get this under your tongue. Don't try to swallow it yet." The gel tasted artificially sweet, almost sickeningly so, but I held it there as instructed, feeling it absorb through the thin membrane. Mrs. Patterson was already on the phone with 911, her voice calm but urgent as she rattled off my symptoms and medical history. Through the haze of my hypoglycemia, I felt a familiar shame burning in my chest. This shouldn't be happening. I was supposed to be in control. "Maya, can you hear me clearly now?" The paramedic's voice cut through my fog about 10 minutes later. The glucose had started working, pulling me back from the edge, but I still felt shaky and disoriented. "I'm Janet. Can you tell me when you last took your insulin?" "This morning," I lied automatically, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. The truth, that I'd taken only half my prescribed dose because that's all I had left, felt too complicated, too embarrassing to explain. Janet's experienced eyes studied my face, and I had the uncomfortable feeling she could see right through me. "Your blood sugar spiked pretty high before this crash. That's consistent with missed or insufficient doses." She made a note on her clipboard. "Are you having trouble accessing your medication?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. I could have said the truth. I could have told her that Dad lost his job at the manufacturing plant 6 months ago, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes in the acoustic panels. "I'm okay now," I said instead. "Really, this was just stress from finals coming up." Janet didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. I'd like to transport you to the hospital for observation. Severe hypoglycemic episodes can have delayed effects, and no, the word came out sharper than I intended. No hospital. I'm fine. My parents can't. We don't have insurance right now. Another lie. We had insurance, but the copays and deductibles were astronomical, especially with Dad unemployed. Another reason for the whispered arguments that kept me awake at night. By the time my mother arrived at school, I was sitting upright in the nurse's office. My blood sugar stabilized, but my hands were still trembling slightly. Mom looked frazzled, her usually perfect makeup smudged and her work blouse wrinkled. She managed a hotel downtown, long hours for modest pay, and leaving during the day meant lost wages we couldn't afford. Maya, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like industrial cleaning products and worry. I promise we'll get your prescription filled today. I just needed to wait for my paycheck to clear, and then your sister needed. She stopped mid-sentence, catching herself, but it was too late. The pieces clicked together in my mind like a jigsaw puzzle I'd been trying to ignore. Chloe's Sweet 16 party was this Saturday, the party Mom and Dad had been planning for months, the party that was supposed to show everyone that the Chen family was still doing fine despite Dad's unemployment. What did Chloe need that was more important than my insulin? I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer. Mom's silence was deafening. She busied herself with gathering my things, avoiding my eyes. Let's just get you home, okay? We can talk about this later. But I didn't want to talk about it later. I wanted answers now, while the fear of my hypoglycemic episode was still fresh, while the memory of my vision going dark was still sharp enough to cut. Mom, what did Chloe need that was more important than my insulin? The nurse cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued at home, she suggested, but her eyes held a knowing sadness that made my stomach twist. The drive home was suffocatingly quiet. Mom's knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and she kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror like she was afraid I might disappear. Our neighborhood looked shabbier in the afternoon light. Lawns that needed mowing, houses that needed fresh paint, dreams that needed renewing. Inside, the house felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. Chloe's party decorations were scattered across the dining room table, silver and pink streamers, helium balloons that bobbed lazily near the ceiling, and a guest list written in her careful cursive. 57 names. 57 people who would witness either our family's triumphant celebration or our spectacular failure. Maya! Chloe bounced down the stairs, her face lighting up with genuine joy. At 15, my younger sister possessed an infectious optimism that I sometimes envied. She was everything I wasn't, spontaneous where I was cautious, emotional where I was analytical, carefree where I carried the weight of my medical condition like a stone in my chest. Oh my God, Jordan texted me about what happened at school. Are you okay? She wrapped me in a hug that smelled like her vanilla body spray and teenage fearlessness. Mom said she was getting your insulin today, so everything should be fine now, right? Over her shoulder, I watched Mom's face crumble slightly. The guilt was written in every line around her eyes, in the way her shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. I wanted to hate her in that moment, wanted to rage against the choice she'd made. But all I felt was a bone-deep exhaustion. Right, I said softly, patting Chloe's back. Everything's fine. But as I climbed the stairs to my room, I caught a glimpse of the pharmacy bag on the kitchen counter. Not the familiar orange bottle of my Humalog, but a receipt. A receipt for party supplies, candy, soda, all the things that could kill me if my blood sugar spiraled out of control again. In my room, I sat on my bed and stared at my glucose monitor. The number was normal now, thanks to the paramedics' intervention, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. Without insulin, my body was a ticking time bomb. I had maybe 12 hours before the next crisis, maybe less if I ate anything substantial. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Dr. Reeves's office number. My endocrinologist had been managing my diabetes since I was 12, and she'd always told me to call if there was ever an emergency. But what do you say? How do you explain that your parents chose a party over your life-saving medication?
How do you admit that you've been playing Russian roulette with your blood sugar because you're too proud to ask for help? The phone rang twice before the receptionist answered. Dr. Reeves's office, this is Patricia. Hi, this is Maya Chen. I'm one of Dr. Reeves's patients, and I need to speak with her about my insulin prescription. Of course, honey, is this urgent, or can we schedule you for next week? I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical force. If I told the truth, if I explained what was really happening, there would be consequences. Questions would be asked. Reports might be filed. My family's carefully constructed facade of normalcy would shatter like glass. But if I didn't... It's urgent, I whispered. It's very urgent. The appointment with Dr. Reeves was until the next morning, which meant I had to survive another night on insulin fumes and sheer willpower. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my glucose monitor beeping softly every hour like a metronome counting down to disaster. Each reading was higher than the last: 180, 210, 245. My body was slowly poisoning itself without the insulin it needed to process sugar. And there was nothing I could do but wait and try not to panic. Downstairs, I could hear my parents' voices through the thin walls, not quite arguing, but engaged in that particular type of tense conversation that married couples have when they're trying not to wake the children. Mom's voice was higher than usual, stressed and defensive, while Dad's responses came in low, guilty murmurs. Every few minutes, Chloe's laughter would bubble up from the living room where she was probably scrolling through social media, blissfully unaware that her party had potentially cost me my life.
Around midnight, my bedroom door creaked open and Mom peeked in. The hallway light created a halo around her silhouette, making her look almost angelic, if you ignored the worry lines etched deep around her eyes. "Maya, are you awake, sweetheart?" I could have pretended to be sleeping, could have avoided the conversation I knew was coming, but my blood sugar was 267 and climbing. The metallic taste in my mouth and the constant thirst were becoming impossible to ignore. "Yeah, Mom, I'm up." She slipped into my room and perched on the edge of my bed, her weight making the old mattress springs protest. Up close, I could see she'd been crying. Her mascara had left faint, dark smudges under her eyes, and her usually perfect hair was disheveled from running her fingers through it. "I need to explain about today," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "About your insulin." "You don't have to explain anything." The lie came easily, a protective barrier I'd built up over years of being the responsible daughter. I know money's tight since Dad lost his job. But even as I said it, I couldn't stop myself from glancing toward my desk, where a stack of Chloe's party invitations sat next to my diabetes supply organizer. The contrast was stark and painful. Elegant cardstock announcing a celebration next to the medical paraphernalia that kept me alive. "It's not that simple," Mom said, following my gaze. "Your insurance approved the insulin. The copay was only $40, but Chloe's cake... The venue deposit was due today, and if we didn't pay, we'd lose the booking and forfeit the money we'd already put down." $40. My life was worth $40 less than my sister's party cake. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand how she could have made such a choice. But I also saw the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she fidgeted with her wedding ring. Mom had been holding our family together with spit and prayers since Dad's layoff, working double shifts at the hotel, skipping meals to make sure Chloe and I had enough to eat. "I was going to get it tomorrow," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "My paycheck was supposed to clear by 5, and the pharmacy stays open until midnight. But then you had your episode at school, and I realized..." She took a shuddering breath. "I realized I'd gambled with your life." I reached for her hand, surprising us both. Her skin was dry and rough from the harsh chemicals she used cleaning hotel rooms, but her grip was warm and desperate. "Mom, I'm okay. The paramedic got my sugar back up, and I'm managing tonight. We'll figure it out." But we both knew I wasn't really okay. My glucose monitor chose that moment to beep again, displaying a new reading, 289, dangerously high.
At this rate, I'd be in diabetic ketoacidosis by morning, a potentially fatal condition that would require immediate hospitalization. Maya, you're reading. Mom's face went pale as she read the number over my shoulder. It's fine, I lied, quickly turning the device face down. Just a temporary spike. It'll come down. She studied my face in the dim light, and I could see her maternal instincts warring with her desperate need to believe that everything would somehow work out. Finally, she sighed and kissed my forehead, her lips dry and warm against my skin. "I'll call Dr. Reeves first thing in the morning," she promised. "We'll figure out a payment plan or something. I won't let anything happen to you, baby. I promise." After she left, I lay in the darkness, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. Through my window, I could see the lights of other houses on our street. Families, presumably sleeping peacefully, not calculating insulin to carbohydrate ratios or worrying about ketoacidosis. Normal families who didn't have to choose between birthday parties and life-saving medications. I must have dozed fitfully because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my curtains, and my phone was buzzing with a text from Jordan. "How are you feeling today? Do you need me to drive you to school?"
School. The thought of sitting through classes, pretending everything was normal while my blood sugar climbed toward dangerous levels felt impossible. But staying home would mean questions I wasn't ready to answer, concerns I wasn't prepared to address. I checked my glucose, 324, the highest reading I'd ever recorded. My mouth felt like I'd been eating cotton, and my head pounded with each heartbeat. I stumbled to the bathroom and tested my urine for ketones, the dangerous byproducts that accumulate when your body starts breaking down fat for energy because it can't process glucose. The test strip turned deep purple, positive for ketones. I was officially in trouble. Downstairs, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the want ads, though I suspected he was staring at the newsprint without really seeing it. He looked up when I entered, and I saw his face cycle through a complicated series of emotions: guilt, fear, determination, and something that might have been shame. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice carefully cheerful. "Mom's already left for work, but she said to tell you she made you an appointment with Dr. Reeves for 10 o'clock. I poured myself a glass of water, the third since waking up, and sat across from him. Dad looked older than his 47 years, the stress of unemployment etched in the gray that had appeared at his temples seemingly overnight. Before the layoff, he'd been the type of man who fixed everything with his hands and his determination. Now he sat at our kitchen table applying for jobs that paid half what he used to make, his calloused fingers struggling with online applications that seemed designed to humiliate him. "Dad, about yesterday," I started, but he held up a hand. "No, Maya, let me say this." He folded the newspaper carefully, his movements precise in the way of men who are holding themselves together through sheer force of will. "I failed you. We failed you. There's no excuse for what we did, and I need you to know that it will never happen again. But Chloe's party can be canceled." His voice was firm, final. "I already called the venue this morning. We'll lose the deposits, but that's on us. Your health, your life comes before any party, before anything." I stared at him, feeling a complex mix of relief and guilt crash over me. "Dad, you can't cancel Chloe's party. She's been planning it for months. All her friends are expecting—" "Maya." He reached across the table and took my hands, his rough palms engulfing my fingers. "Look at me, baby girl. Really look at me." I met his eyes, seeing the pain and determination there, the love that had gotten lost somewhere in the stress of job applications and unpaid bills, and the daily grind of trying to keep our family afloat. "You are my daughter," he said quietly. "You are my child, and I am supposed to protect you. Yesterday, I let you down in the worst possible way. I prioritized a party over your life, and I will carry that shame with me forever. But I promise you, on everything I hold sacred, it will never happen again." Tears burned my eyes, though whether from his words or my elevated blood sugar, I couldn't tell. I don't want to be the reason Chloe's dreams get ruined. She doesn't deserve that. And you don't deserve to ration your insulin like it's a luxury item. His voice carried a fierce protectiveness that reminded me of the father who used to chase away my nightmares and fix my broken toys. The front door opened with a bang, and Chloe bounced into the kitchen like a human hurricane, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her hair still damp from her shower. She was already dressed for school in her carefully curated outfit, ripped jeans, a vintage band t-shirt, and the combat boots she'd begged for last Christmas.
"Morning, family," she chirped, heading straight for the refrigerator. "Maya, Jordan's outside. He said something about driving you to your doctor's appointment?" She turned to look at me, her expression shifting from cheerful to concerned as she took in my appearance. "Whoa, you look terrible. Are you okay?" "Just tired," I said automatically, though I knew I probably looked as bad as I felt. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and dark circles shadowed my eyes. Chloe frowned, her intuitive nature picking up on the tension in the room. "Is this about your diabetes thing yesterday? Mom said it was just stress, but Jordan seemed really worried when he texted me." "It's nothing for you to worry about," Dad said, but his voice carried a heaviness that made Chloe's frown deepen. "Okay, but—" She hesitated, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "If you need anything at all, you know I'm here, right? I mean, I know I'm the annoying little sister and everything, but you're still my person." The simple sincerity in her voice nearly broke me. Chloe had no idea that her party had almost cost me my life. No idea that Dad was considering canceling it to pay for my medical needs. She was just 15, worried about her sister and trying to navigate her own complicated teenage world. "I know," I whispered, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "Thank you." Jordan's horn honked outside, and I grabbed my backpack, checking to make sure my glucose monitor and emergency supplies were inside. What little I had left, anyway. "Maya," Dad called as I headed for the door. "After your appointment, we're going to sit down as a family and figure this out. All of it. No more secrets, no more pretending everything's fine when it's not." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and headed outside where Jordan was waiting in his beat-up Honda Civic. He took one look at my face and didn't ask any questions, just turned up the music and drove toward Dr. Reeves' office while I pressed my forehead against the cool window and tried not to think about what the next few hours might bring. The medical complex where Dr. Reeves practiced was a sprawling brick building that smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. I'd been coming here since I was 12, but today the familiar hallways felt different, charged with the weight of the conversation I was about to have. Jordan squeezed my shoulder as we approached the endocrinology wing. "Want me to come in with you?" he asked, though we both knew he couldn't. Medical appointments were private things, especially when they involved admitting that your parents had chosen a party over your insulin. "I'll be okay," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. "Thanks for the ride." Dr. Reeves was waiting for me in exam room 3, her graying hair pulled back in its usual efficient bun and her white coat pristine, despite it being barely 10 in the morning. She'd been my endocrinologist for 5 years, and in that time she'd seen me through the awkward transition from childhood to teenage diabetes management, the struggles with insurance coverage, and the normal ups and downs of living with a chronic condition. But she'd never seen me like this. "Maya," she said, her voice warm but concerned as she looked up from my chart. "Patricia said you called yesterday about an urgent insulin issue. How are you feeling right now?" I settled into the familiar exam chair and pulled out my glucose monitor. "My blood sugar has been high since yesterday afternoon. I'm reading 334 this morning, and I'm positive for ketones." Dr. Reeves' eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained professionally calm. "That's quite elevated. Have you been taking your insulin as prescribed?" This was the moment of truth, the point where I had to decide whether to keep protecting my parents or to finally tell someone what was really happening. I looked at Dr. Reeves' kind, intelligent face and made my choice. "I ran out yesterday morning," I said quietly. "I've been trying to stretch my supply for the past few days because my parents couldn't afford the refill.
The silence that followed was different from the awkward pauses with my mother. This was the silence of a medical professional processing information, calculating risks, considering options. Maya, Dr. Reeves said carefully, are you telling me that you've been without insulin for over 24 hours? I nodded, feeling tears prick at my eyes. They promised they'd get it refilled, but then my sister's birthday party. The deposits were due and they had to choose. They chose a party over your insulin? There was no judgment in her voice, just a quiet horror that made my chest tighten. It's not their fault, I said quickly. Dad lost his job and money's really tight and they thought they could get it today. But then I had the episode at school. Dr. Reeves was already moving, pulling out her prescription pad and scribbling notes. Maya, listen to me very carefully. You're in the early stages of diabetic ketoacidosis. If we don't get insulin into your system immediately, you could go into a coma within the next few hours. The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd known I was in trouble, but hearing it stated so clinically made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I'm going to give you an injection right now to bring your blood sugar down, she continued, already preparing a syringe. Then we need to call your parents. This is a reportable incident, Maya. When a minor can't access life-saving medication because of financial issues, there are protocols we have to follow. Please don't call child services, I whispered. Please, it was just one mistake. My parents love me. They're struggling. Dr. Reeves paused, the syringe halfway to my arm. Maya, I've known you for 5 years. You're responsible, mature, and incredibly good at managing your condition. For you to end up in ketoacidosis because you couldn't access your insulin, this isn't about one mistake. This is about a system that failed you. She administered the injection with the efficient gentleness of someone who'd done it thousands of times, then sat back in her chair to study my face. I want you to understand something, she said quietly. What happened to you yesterday, that hypoglycemic episode at school, could have killed you, and what's happening right now, this ketoacidosis, could also kill you. Your parents may love you, but love doesn't treat diabetes. Insulin does. And if they can't reliably provide that insulin, then we need to explore other options. I stared at my hands, feeling the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. Other options. Foster care. Being separated from my family. Chloe growing up without her big sister. My parents' shame and guilt destroying what was left of our family unit. What if they promise it won't happen again? I asked desperately. What if we set up some kind of payment plan or apply for assistance programs or... Maya, Dr. Reeves' voice was gentle but firm. Those are all good ideas, and we'll explore every one of them, but first I need to make sure you're safe. And right now, that means having a very serious conversation with your parents about priorities, about the reality of managing a chronic condition, and about what could have happened if Jordan hadn't been there to help you yesterday. She picked up the phone, and I knew there was no going back. Whatever happened next, whatever conversations were about to take place, my family would never be the same. The secret was out. The carefully maintained facade of normalcy was about to crumble, and I could only hope that something better might be built from the wreckage. The phone call lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. I know because I watched the digital clock on Dr. Reeves' desk, counting each second like it was a countdown to the end of my family as I knew it. Her voice remained professionally calm throughout the conversation, but I could hear the underlying steel in her tone as she spoke to my mother. Mrs. Chen, I need you and your husband to come to my office immediately. Maya is in diabetic ketoacidosis, and we need to discuss what led to this medical emergency. Yes, I understand you're at work, but your daughter nearly died yesterday, and she's not out of danger yet. No, this cannot wait until this evening. When she hung up, the silence in the exam room felt suffocating. Dr. Reeves made notes in my chart, her pen scratching against paper like tiny accusations.
Every few minutes, she checked my blood pressure and glucose levels, monitoring the slow improvement as the emergency insulin began to work. "How long do we have?" I asked quietly. "They'll be here within the hour," she replied, not looking up from her notes. "Maya, I want you to understand that what happens next isn't about punishment. It's about making sure you have access to the medication you need to stay alive." But I could already imagine the scene that was about to unfold. My parents pulled away from their jobs, sitting in the sterile office while a doctor explained how their choice had nearly killed their daughter. The shame in their eyes, the defensive anger that would follow, the way this would ripple out to affect every aspect of our lives. 38 minutes later, I heard familiar voices in the hallway, Mom's higher-pitched with anxiety, Dad's lower and tight with barely controlled emotion. There was a brief conversation with the receptionist, then footsteps approaching our exam room. I found myself holding my breath. The door opened, and my parents stepped inside, looking like they were entering a courtroom for sentencing. Mom had clearly left work in a hurry. Her hotel uniform was wrinkled, and she still wore her name tag. Dad was in his job interview clothes, the navy suit that was starting to show wear at the elbows, but was still the best thing in his closet. "Maya, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Mom rushed to my side, her hands fluttering over me like she wanted to check for injuries, but didn't know where to start. "Better," I said, which was technically true. The emergency insulin had brought my blood sugar down to 167, still high, but not immediately dangerous. Dr. Reeves gestured to the two chairs across from her desk. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, please have a seat. We need to discuss Maya's condition and what led to yesterday's medical emergency." My parents exchanged a look that carried the weight of 20 years of marriage and recent months of financial stress. They sat down slowly, Dad's hand finding Mom's in a gesture of mutual support. "Maya has explained to me that she's been without insulin for over 24 hours because you couldn't afford to refill her prescription. Is that accurate?" Dad's jaw worked silently for a moment before he spoke. "We had some temporary cash flow issues. I lost my job 6 months ago, and while we have insurance, the copays and unexpected expenses have been challenging. I understand financial difficulties can be overwhelming, but I need to help you understand what those cash flow issues nearly cost you. Maya, would you show your parents your glucose readings from last night?" With trembling hands, I pulled out my monitor and scrolled through the stored readings. It started at 180 around dinner time. By midnight, I was at 267. This morning, I hit 334. Mom's face went pale. What does that mean exactly? Dr. Reeves turned her computer screen toward them, pulling up a chart that illustrated blood glucose ranges. Normal blood sugar should be between 80 and 120. Maya's readings indicate she was in severe hyperglycemia, approaching diabetic ketoacidosis. At 334, she was entering a range that can cause coma or death. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. I watched my parents' faces cycle through disbelief, horror, and dawning comprehension. Dad's hand tightened around Mom's until his knuckles went white. "But she seemed okay this morning," Mom whispered. "A little tired, maybe, but she was talking normally. She ate breakfast." "Maya is exceptionally good at managing her condition and hiding her symptoms," Dr. Reeves said. "That's actually part of the problem. She's learned to minimize her needs to avoid burdening her family, which means you may not realize how serious her condition is until it's too late." She pulled out a folder and spread several documents across her desk. "I've prepared some information for you about assistance programs, patient advocacy groups, and pharmacy discount programs. But first, I need to understand exactly what happened yesterday." The silence stretched until Dad finally spoke. "Maya's younger sister is turning 16 this Saturday. We'd planned a party, put down deposits for the venue and catering. Yesterday morning, they called to say the final payment was due immediately or we'd forfeit everything we'd already paid."
And Maya's insulin prescription? Was a $40 copay, Mom said, her voice barely audible. $40 that we didn't have until my paycheck cleared. Dr. Reeves leaned back in her chair, studying my parents with an expression I couldn't quite read. So you chose to pay for a party rather than purchase life-saving medication for your daughter. It wasn't that simple, Dad said, his voice rising slightly. We thought we could get the insulin the next day. We didn't know Maya was already running low, didn't know she'd been rationing her doses. You didn't know because you didn't ask, Dr. Reeves replied, her tone still professional but carrying a sharp edge. Maya, when did you start rationing your insulin? All eyes turned to me, and I felt the familiar weight of being caught between protecting my parents and protecting myself. About a week ago, maybe longer. I was trying to make it stretch until you could afford the refill. The sound Mom made was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Maya, why didn't you tell us? Because I didn't want to add to your stress. Dad's been so worried about finding work, and you've been working double shifts, and I thought if I could just manage for a few more days, manage by risking your life, Dr. Reeves interjected. Maya, show your parents the ketone test from this morning. I pulled out the test strip, now dry, but still showing the deep purple color that indicated dangerous levels of ketones in my system. When your body can't process glucose because there's no insulin, it starts breaking down fat and muscle for energy. The byproducts are called ketones, and they're toxic in high concentrations. Dad stared at the test strip like it was evidence in a murder trial. What would have happened if she hadn't gotten emergency treatment, diabetic coma, possibly death? Dr. Reeves' words were clinical, factual, but they hit my parents like physical blows. Maya, we almost killed our daughter for a birthday party. You made a choice based on incomplete information and financial stress, Dr. Reeves said, her tone softening slightly. But now we need to make sure it never happens again. Maya, I want you to tell your parents what you've been experiencing over the past week.
I took a shaky breath and began to speak. I told them about the constant thirst, the fatigue I'd been attributing to schoolwork, the way I'd been calculating and recalculating insulin doses like a mathematical puzzle. I described the fear that woke me up at night, the dreams where I collapsed in public and no one knew how to help me. I've been carrying glucose tablets in every pocket, I said, my voice growing stronger as the words poured out. I mapped out the locations of every vending machine at school in case I needed emergency sugar. I memorized the symptoms of diabetic ketoacidosis and checked myself constantly. I've been living like I'm walking a tightrope, and yesterday I finally fell. The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of medical equipment. Dad had his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. Mom was staring at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I never wanted you to know, I continued, because I knew you'd blame yourselves. I knew you'd feel guilty and ashamed, and you're already carrying so much. But Dr. Reeves is right. Love doesn't treat diabetes. Insulin does. And I can't keep managing this disease on hope and rationing. Dr. Reeves reached across her desk and placed a hand on Mom's arm. Mrs. Chen, I've been Maya's doctor for 5 years. She's one of the most responsible, mature patients I've ever worked with. The fact that she was willing to risk her life rather than add to your financial burden tells me everything I need to know about your family dynamic. But it also tells me that something needs to change. She pulled out a thick packet of papers. I've prepared applications for several assistance programs. The manufacturer of Maya's insulin offers significant discounts for families experiencing financial hardship. There's also a state program that can help cover medical expenses for chronically ill children. We're not charity cases, Dad said, quietly, but there was no real conviction in his voice. You're a family dealing with unemployment and medical expenses, Dr. Reeves replied. That's not charity. That's community support for people facing temporary challenges. Maya's health is more important than your pride. She turned to address us all. I also need to discuss the immediate plan. Maya's insulin supply needs to be refilled today, and we need to establish a system to ensure this never happens again. I already called the venue this morning, canceled Chloe's party. We'll lose the deposits, but that money should cover Maya's medications for the next several months. I felt a stab of guilt and sadness for my sister, but also relief so profound it made me dizzy. What did you tell Chloe? The truth, Mom said, wiping her eyes with a tissue Dr. Reeves had provided. That we made a terrible mistake in our priorities, and that your health comes before any party. How did she take it? Dad managed a weak smile. Better than we deserved. She said she'd rather have her sister alive than have the perfect Sweet 16. She wants to plan a small family celebration instead, pizza and a movie night. The conversation continued for another hour, covering emergency protocols, warning signs to watch for, and the importance of honest communication about medical needs. Dr. Reeves provided phone numbers for crisis intervention services and detailed instructions for managing diabetes during financial stress. As we prepared to leave, she pulled me aside while my parents gathered the informational materials she'd given them. Maya, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you feel safe at home? Do you trust that your parents will prioritize your medical needs going forward?
I looked through the doorway at my parents, saw Dad carefully folding the assistance program applications while Mom wrote down the pharmacy's phone number in her meticulous handwriting. They looked older than they had this morning, worn down by the weight of nearly losing me, but there was also a determination in their posture that hadn't been there before. Yes, I said. I think this scared them enough that they'll never let it happen again. Dr. Reeves nodded. I'm going to call and check on you in a few days. If you ever find yourself without insulin or unable to access your medication, I want you to call me directly. I'll provide emergency supplies if necessary. Your life is too valuable to risk on hope and good intentions. The drive home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense silence of the previous day. This was the quiet of a family that had looked over the edge of a cliff and stepped back, shaken but intact. Dad drove carefully, his hands steady on the wheel, while Mom sat in the passenger seat with a pharmacy bag containing a month's supply of insulin paid for with the deposit money from Chloe's canceled party. When we pulled into our driveway, Chloe was sitting on the front porch steps, still in her school clothes, but with her knees drawn up to her chest, in a posture that made her look younger than her 15 years. She stood up as we approached, her eyes searching our faces for clues about what had happened. Is Maya okay? She asked, without preamble. I'm okay, though we all knew it was more complicated than that. But we need to talk, all of us. Inside, we gathered in the living room, the same room where Chloe's party decorations were still scattered across the coffee table, now looking somehow tragic in the afternoon light. Dad sat in his recliner, while Mom perched on the edge of the couch next to Chloe. I chose the chair across from them, wanting to see everyone's faces for this conversation. Chloe, I began, I need to tell you what really happened yesterday and why your party had to be canceled. Over the next 30 minutes, I explained everything, the rationing, the medical emergency, the choice our parents had been forced to make. Chloe listened with the intense focus she usually reserved for her favorite Netflix shows, her expression shifting from confusion to horror to understanding. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers picking at the hem of her school uniform skirt. So, you almost died because I wanted a fancy party, she said finally. No, Dad said firmly. Maya almost died because we made a terrible decision about priorities. That's on us, not on you. But if I hadn't pushed for such an expensive party, if I'd been okay with something smaller... Chloe, I interrupted, reaching for her hand. You're 15. You're supposed to want parties and celebrations and all the normal teenager things. This isn't your fault. She looked up at me, tears making her eyes bright. But I knew money was tight. I knew you guys were stressed about Dad's job situation. I should have been more understanding. Mom moved closer to Chloe on the couch, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Sweetheart, we should have been honest with both of you about our financial situation, instead of trying to pretend everything was normal. We put pressure on ourselves to provide things we couldn't afford, and we lost sight of what's truly important. Your sister's health and safety, Dad added, that should have been our only priority.
Chloe wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture so achingly young it made my chest tight. So, what happens now? I mean, with my birthday and everything. We're going to celebrate, I said, surprised by the certainty in my voice. Maybe not the way we originally planned, but we're going to make it special. What matters is being together, not how much money we spend.
Pizza party in the backyard? She suggested tentatively. With fairy lights and that playlist you've been working on for months, Mom added. And maybe we can ask a few of your closest friends to join us. For the first time since we'd gotten home, Chloe's face broke into a genuine smile. Actually, that sounds kind of perfect. More intimate, like actually about celebrating instead of just showing off. We spent the evening planning Chloe's revised birthday celebration, but more importantly, we talked about the changes our family needed to make. Dad would apply for the assistance programs Dr. Reeves had recommended, swallowing his pride for the sake of my health. Mom would reduce her hours at work. The overtime pay wasn't worth the stress it was putting on all of us. And I would be completely honest about my medical needs. No more martyrdom or trying to protect everyone else from the reality of living with diabetes. From now on, Dad said, as we cleaned up after dinner, Maya's medical needs come first. No exceptions, no compromises, no choosing between insulin and anything else. What if there's another emergency? Chloe asked. Like, what if the car breaks down and you need the insulin money for repairs? Then we call Dr. Reeves, or we go to the emergency room, or we figure out another solution. But we never, ever let Maya go without her medication again. As I got ready for bed that night, I checked my blood sugar one more time. 142. Still slightly elevated, but well within the safe range. For the first time in weeks, I went to sleep without fear, without calculating how many hours I might have left, without wondering if I'd wake up in the morning. But even as relief flooded through me, I knew our family had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past 2 days. We'd learned that love, while necessary, wasn't sufficient to manage a chronic illness. We'd discovered that pride could be as dangerous as any medical emergency. And we'd faced the terrifying reality that good intentions and financial stress could create life-threatening situations. The next morning brought a phone call that would change everything even further. I was getting ready for school, feeling more normal than I had in days. When Dad answered the kitchen phone with his usual cautious hello, the tone he developed since losing his job, always half expecting bad news or bill collectors. But this time, his expression shifted from wariness to confusion to something that might have been hope. Yes, this is Robert Chen. What? Are you sure? When did this happen? Yes, I can be there this afternoon. He hung up the phone and turned to face us, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. That was Harrison Manufacturing, the company that laid me off 6 months ago. Apparently, they just landed a major contract and they want me back. Not just back, they want me as a shift supervisor. It's a promotion from my old position. The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator. After 6 months of rejection letters and failed interviews, after yesterday's medical emergency and the stark conversation about priorities, this news felt almost surreal. What did you tell them? Mom asked quietly. That I'd be there this afternoon to discuss terms. Dad's voice was steady, but I could see the emotion working behind his eyes. The salary they quoted is 40% more than I was making before, with benefits that include a much better health insurance plan. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Financial stability wouldn't solve all our problems, but it would mean never having to choose between insulin and anything else ever again.
But as I watched my parents embrace in our kitchen, relief and joy and 6 months of pent-up stress finally finding release, I also realized something important. This crisis had taught us lessons we needed to learn regardless of our financial situation, about communication, about priorities, about the difference between pride and protection. The insulin crisis was over, but in many ways, our real family healing was just beginning. 3 days after Dad returned to work at Harrison Manufacturing, Dr. Reeves called our house with news that would shatter whatever sense of recovery we'd managed to build. I was in my room doing homework when I heard Mom answer the phone downstairs, her voice bright with the cautious optimism that had characterized our family since Dad's job offer. Maya Chen's residence, this is Linda speaking. Oh, Dr. Reeves. Hello. Maya's doing much better. Her blood sugars have been stable. What? I don't understand. The shift in her tone made me abandon my calculus textbook and creep to the top of the stairs, my heart already beginning to race with a familiar anxiety. Through the banister, I could see Mom gripping the kitchen counter, her knuckles white against the formica surface. Are you absolutely certain? There must be some mistake. When did this happen? Why weren't we notified immediately? Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway, his work clothes still dusty from the manufacturing floor, concern etched across his face as he watched Mom's expression grow increasingly pale. Yes, we'll be there first thing in the morning. All of us. Thank you for calling, Doctor. She hung up the phone and turned to face Dad, her hand pressed against her mouth as if she could hold back whatever words were trying to escape. Linda, what is it? What's wrong? I couldn't hear her response from upstairs, but I saw Dad's face crumble, saw him reach for the counter to steady himself. Whatever Dr. Reeves had told my mother, it was bad enough to knock the foundation out from under a man who'd just gotten his life back on track. Unable to bear the suspense any longer, I made my way downstairs, each step feeling like I was descending into something I wasn't prepared to face. Mom? Dad? What's going on? They turned toward me in unison, their faces carrying matching expressions of devastation and something that looked like guilt. Dad opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, seeming to struggle with how to begin. Maya, sweetheart, Mom said, finally, her voice shaky but determined. Dr. Reeves called with some concerning information about your medical records. What kind of concerning information? She's been reviewing your case file as part of a quality assurance audit. Apparently, there were some discrepancies in your treatment history that she needed to investigate further. The vague non-answers sent a chill down my spine. What kind of discrepancies? Mom and Dad exchanged a look that carried the weight of parental communication, the kind of silent conversation that happens when adults are trying to decide how much truth a child can handle. We have an appointment tomorrow morning. All of us. Dr. Reeves wants to discuss her findings in person. That night, sleep eluded me completely. I lay in bed, running through every possible scenario, every medical mistake or insurance issue that could have prompted such an ominous phone call. My glucose monitor showed normal readings, 132, 118, 125, but my anxiety was through the roof, creating its own kind of physical distress. Around 3 a.m, I heard soft footsteps in the hallway, and my door creaked open just enough for Chloe to peek inside. Maya? Are you awake? Yeah, come in. She slipped into my room and climbed onto my bed, curling up next to me like she used to do during thunderstorms when we were younger. At 15, she was almost as tall as me, but in the darkness, she felt small and vulnerable. I heard Mom crying after you went upstairs. Do you think there's something really wrong? Like, seriously wrong? I wanted to reassure her, to play the role of protective older sister and promise that everything would be fine. But the fear in her voice matched the terror that had been building in my chest since Mom hung up that phone. I don't know, I admitted, but whatever it is, we'll face it together, okay? As a family. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that seems designed to match difficult conversations. We drove to Dr. Reeves' office in relative silence, each of us lost in our own anxious thoughts. Dad had taken another day off work, something that would have been impossible just a week ago, and his new supervisor had been understanding about the family medical emergency. The waiting room felt different this time, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Other patients sat reading magazines or scrolling through their phones, blissfully unaware that the Chen family was about to receive news that would change everything. Maya Chen? The medical assistant's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. Dr. Reeves will see you and your family now. We followed her down the familiar hallway to exam room 3, but instead of the usual setup, there were 4 chairs arranged in a circle. Dr. Reeves was already seated, a thick file folder in her lap, and an expression on her face that I'd never seen before. Something between professional concern and personal devastation. "Thank you all for coming," she said as we settled into our seats. "I know my phone call yesterday was alarming, and I want to address your concerns as directly as possible." She opened the folder, revealing pages of medical records, test results, and what looked like correspondence with insurance companies. The documentation of my diabetes management over the past 5 years laid out like evidence in a case I didn't understand. Over the past few days, I've been conducting a comprehensive review of Maya's medical history, prompted by the insulin rationing incident we discussed. What I've discovered has left me deeply concerned, not just about Maya's current condition, but about the care she's received over the past several years. Dad leaned forward in his chair. "What do you mean? Maya has always had excellent blood sugar control, minimal complications." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Reeves replied, her voice carrying a weight that made the air in the room feel thick. "Maya's control has been too good, suspiciously good, especially considering the financial constraints your family has been experiencing." She pulled out a chart showing my A1C levels, the blood test that measures average blood sugar over 3 months, going back to my diagnosis at age 12. "Look at these numbers," she said, pointing to the consistent readings between 6.8 and 7.2. For a teenager managing type 1 diabetes, especially one dealing with the stress of adolescence, family financial strain, and inconsistent medication access, these levels are almost impossibly stable. I stared at the chart, not understanding why my good control was being presented as evidence of a problem. "I don't understand. Isn't it good to control what we've been working towards?" Dr. Reeves met my eyes with an expression of infinite sadness. "Maya, when I reviewed your pharmacy records for the past 2 years, I discovered something that breaks my heart. You haven't been picking up your full insulin prescriptions." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around me, I could feel my parents' confusion and growing alarm, but I was trapped in a bubble of dawning horror as Dr. Reeves continued. "The pharmacy records show that you've been consistently short on your insulin supply, not by a few days here and there, but by weeks at a time. Your prescriptions were written for 28 days supplies, but you were making them last 35 to 40 days, every single month for the past 2 years. Mom's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. "That's impossible. Maya gets her insulin refilled every month. We have a reminder on our calendar." "Mrs. Chen, the pharmacy records don't lie." Dr. Reeves pulled out a computer printout showing dates and quantities. "Maya has been rationing her insulin far longer than just this past week. She's been systematically underdosing herself to stretch her medication supply." The room began to spin around me as the implications of her words sank in. 2 years. For 2 years, I'd been walking a tightrope between medication rationing and diabetic crisis, and somehow I'd managed to hide it so well that even my own doctor hadn't noticed. "But her A1C levels," Dad's voice sounded hollow, distant, "were being artificially maintained through extreme dietary restriction and obsessive exercise," Dr. Reeves explained. "Maya, I need you to be completely honest with me now. How many calories were you eating per day?" The question I'd been dreading for months, maybe years, hung in the air like a loaded gun. I could feel my parents' eyes on me, could sense their growing understanding of just how deep this deception had gone. "It varied," I whispered, "depending on how much insulin I had left." "Maya," Dr. Reeves's voice was gentle but insistent. "How many calories?"
On good days, maybe 800. On days when I was running low on insulin, sometimes as few as 400. The numbers fell from my lips like confessions, each one a small betrayal of the trust my family had placed in me. The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't bring myself to look at my parents, couldn't bear to see the horror and guilt that I knew would be written across their faces. "Dear God," Mom breathed. "Maya, you were starving yourself." "I wasn't starving myself," I said quickly, defensively. "I was managing my condition with the resources I had available. If I ate less carbs, I needed less insulin. It was just math." It was disordered eating brought on by medical rationing, Dr. Reeves corrected, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine anguish. "Maya, at your age and activity level, you should be consuming between 1,800 and 2,200 calories per day. You were eating less than half of what your body needed." She turned to address my parents directly. This is why Maya's hypoglycemic episode was so severe. Her body had no glycogen stores to draw from because she'd been in a state of chronic malnutrition. When her blood sugar crashed, there was nothing to buffer the fall. Dad's face had gone completely white, all the color draining from his features as he processed the full scope of what had been happening under his own roof. How long has she been doing this? Based on the pharmacy records and Maya's physical presentation, I'd estimate at least 2 years, possibly longer. I've also requested Maya's school medical records, and there are several instances of her visiting the nurse for fatigue or stomach upset, classic symptoms of inadequate nutrition. "Why didn't you tell us?" Mom's voice broke on the question. "Maya, why didn't you say something?"
I finally looked up at her, seeing my own pain reflected in her eyes, but magnified by parental guilt and love. Because every time I needed a prescription refilled, I could see how much it stressed you out. Dad would get that look on his face when he had to use the credit card for my medical expenses. You'd both go quiet during dinner, and I knew you were calculating whether we could afford groceries and insulin in the same month. So you decided to just eat less? Chloe's voice was small, confused. She'd been so quiet, I'd almost forgotten she was there. It wasn't a decision at first, I explained, the words pouring out now that the dam had broken. It just happened gradually. I'd skip lunch at school because I'd forgotten to pack anything, and then I'd noticed my blood sugar was more stable. So I started being more careful about what I ate. Then more careful became restrictive, and restrictive became this. Dr. Reeves leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "Maya, I need you to understand something very important. What you've been doing, the food restriction, the insulin rationing, it's not sustainable. Your body has been cannibalizing itself for energy. You've likely lost significant muscle mass, and your bone density is probably compromised. If you'd continued on this path much longer, the consequences would have been irreversible." "What kind of consequences?" Dad's voice was barely audible. "Growth stunting, osteoporosis, cardiac arrhythmias, kidney damage, and eventually organ failure." Each medical term landed like a physical blow. Maya's body has been in survival mode for years, and that kind of chronic stress does permanent damage. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Mom crying, soft, heartbroken sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Dad sat motionless, his hands clenched in his lap, staring at the floor like he was trying to memorize the pattern in the carpet. "There's something else," Dr. Reeves said quietly. "Something that might be the most difficult part of this conversation." I couldn't imagine what could be worse than what she'd already revealed, but her tone suggested we hadn't yet reached the bottom of this particular hell. Maya's insurance company has been tracking her prescription patterns. Before we continue with what happened next,
I want to remind you that stories like Maya's take time and effort to research and share. If you're finding value in this, please hit that subscribe button and share with someone who needs to hear this message. They flagged her case 6 months ago as potential medication noncompliance, which triggered an investigation into possible insurance fraud. Insurance fraud? Dad's head snapped up. We've never committed insurance fraud. The insurance company's position is that if Maya wasn't taking her prescribed medication as directed, then they were being billed for unnecessary medical services. Her regular endocrinology appointments, her lab work, her diabetes supplies, all of it becomes questionable if she wasn't actually using the medication as prescribed. The implications hit me like a tsunami. They're going to drop my coverage.
They're considering it, Dr. Reeves confirmed, which is why we need to act quickly. I'm recommending immediate inpatient treatment to address the malnutrition and get Maya's diabetes management back on track under medical supervision. Inpatient treatment? Mom wiped her eyes with a tissue. Like, in the hospital? A specialized eating disorder facility that has experience with medically complex cases. Maya's situation is unique. She has an eating disorder that developed as a response to rationing life-saving medication. It requires specialized treatment that addresses both the psychological and medical aspects of her condition. I felt the walls of the exam room closing in around me. Eating disorder facility. The words carried implications I wasn't ready to face. Admissions about my relationship with food and control that I'd been avoiding for years. I don't have an eating disorder, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt hollow. I was just managing my diabetes with limited resources. Maya, Dr. Reeves said gently, you've been consuming less than 800 calories per day while maintaining a full academic schedule and managing a chronic illness. You've been obsessively calculating carbohydrate ratios and insulin doses to the point where you've lost sight of basic nutritional needs. That's not diabetes management. That's disordered eating with a medical trigger. She turned back to my parents. The facility I'm recommending specializes in cases where eating disorders develop secondary to medical conditions. They understand the complex relationship between diabetes management and food restriction. Maya would receive intensive medical monitoring, nutritional rehabilitation, and therapy to address the underlying psychological patterns that led to this situation. How long? Chloe asked, speaking up for the first time in several minutes. Typically 30 to 60 days for the initial stabilization phase, followed by intensive outpatient treatment. Dr. Reeves consulted her notes. The good news is that this type of treatment is typically covered by insurance, even if there are questions about Maya's medication compliance. Dad finally looked up from the floor, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. What do we need to do? I've already contacted the facility and explained Maya's case. They have a bed available starting Monday, which gives us the weekend to prepare. She handed him a packet of information. There are forms to fill out, items Maya will need to pack, and some family sessions that will be required as part of her treatment. I stared at the packet of papers, seeing my immediate future laid out in medical terminology and treatment protocols. Monday. In 4 days, I'd be checking into a facility to address an eating disorder I didn't think I had, triggered by financial stress my family couldn't control. Maya, Dr. Reeves said gently, I need you to understand that this isn't a punishment. This is medical treatment for a serious condition that developed as a result of an impossible situation. You've been incredibly strong, but you've been carrying a burden that no teenager should have to carry alone. Will she be okay? Mom asked, her voice small and broken. Dr. Reeves was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. With proper treatment, Maya can make a full recovery. But the psychological patterns that developed over the past 2 years, the hypervigilance around food, the secretive behaviors, the willingness to sacrifice her health to avoid burdening others, those will take time and therapy to address. She closed Maya's file and looked directly at my parents.
I also want you both to understand that this situation developed because Maya felt responsible for managing not just her own medical condition, but your family's financial stress. She took on a level of responsibility that no child should carry, and she paid for it with her physical and mental health.
The words made my parents go completely white, just as Dr. Reeves had intended. The recognition of their inadvertent role in my condition, the understanding that their own stress and financial struggles had filtered down to me in ways they'd never imagined, was written in every line of their faces. "We failed her," Dad said, his voice hollow. "We failed our daughter so completely that she nearly died rather than ask for help. You failed to recognize the signs of a developing eating disorder in a child who is desperately trying to be helpful," Dr. Reeves corrected. "That doesn't make you bad parents. It makes you human parents dealing with extraordinary stress. But now we know, and now we can fix it." The recognition was finally complete, not just of my condition, but of the complex web of love, guilt, pride, and desperation that had led us to this moment. We were a family that had nearly lost everything because we'd been too proud to ask for help and too loving to burden each other with the truth. The weekend before my admission to Willowbrook Treatment Center passed in a blur of difficult conversations, medical preparations, and the strange ritual of packing for a journey I'd never imagined taking. My room, which had been my sanctuary for 17 years, now felt like a crime scene being processed, evidence of my secret struggle scattered across every surface. Mom sat on my bed Friday evening, helping me sort through the approved items list while Dad worked in the garage, claiming he needed to organize his tools, but really just needing space to process everything Dr. Reeves had revealed. The sound of his impact wrench carried through the walls at odd intervals, punctuated by long silences that spoke to his emotional state better than any conversation could. "Comfortable clothes without drawstrings or underwire," Mom read from the facility guidelines, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "Personal toiletries and travel-size containers, no glass bottles, no electronics with cameras." She trailed off, staring at the paper like it held the secrets of the universe. I folded another soft cotton shirt into my suitcase, movements mechanical and precise. "Mom, you don't have to do this if it's too hard." "Yes, I do." Her response was immediate, fierce. "I should have been doing this all along, really seeing you, really helping you. I'm not going to stop now just because it's difficult." Chloe appeared in my doorway holding 2 books and looking uncertain. "I thought maybe you'd want these," she said, holding up my worn copy of The Book Thief and her own favorite, Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine. "I know the list says books are okay and these might be comforting." The thoughtfulness of her choices, one book that had gotten me through my mother's brief hospitalization 3 years ago, and one that dealt with healing from family trauma, nearly undone me completely. "Thank you," I managed, adding them to the growing pile of approved belongings. "Chloe, I need you to know that none of this is your fault. Not the party, not the canceled celebration, none of it." She perched on the edge of my desk chair, looking younger than her 15 years in her oversized sleep shirt. "I know that intellectually, but emotionally?" She shrugged, a gesture that encompassed the complexity of guilt and understanding. "I keep thinking about all the times you said you weren't hungry, or that you'd already eaten, or that you were too busy studying to come to dinner. I thought you were just being weird about food, but you were actually slowly starving yourself to afford your medication." "Yeah, it sounds pretty crazy when you say it out loud." "It sounds desperate," she corrected, like someone who is drowning and grabbing onto anything that might keep her afloat. The metaphor was more accurate than I wanted to admit. For 2 years, I'd been drowning in the impossible mathematics of chronic illness and financial stress, making increasingly dangerous trade-offs to keep my head above water. The insulin rationing, the food restriction, the obsessive calculations, they'd all been attempts to control an uncontrollable situation. Saturday morning brought a family therapy session with Dr. Reeves and a counselor from Willowbrook named Jordan Martinez. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with kind eyes and the sort of calm presence that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of family dysfunction without judgment. We met in a conference room at Dr. Reeves' office, sitting around a table that felt simultaneously too big and too small for the conversation we were about to have.
Dad had taken a shower and put on his good shirt, like he was preparing for a job interview rather than a discussion about his daughter's eating disorder. Before Maya begins treatment on Monday, Sarah began, it's important that we address the family dynamics that contributed to her condition. This isn't about assigning blame, but about understanding patterns that need to change to support her recovery. She turned to my parents. Dr. Reeves has explained Maya's medical history and the financial stresses your family has been experiencing. I'd like to understand how those stresses were communicated within your household. Mom and Dad exchanged one of their wordless spousal communications before Mom spoke. We tried to shield the girls from our financial problems. We thought if we could handle things quietly, they wouldn't have to worry about adult concerns. How did that shielding manifest practically? Sarah asked. We had discussions about money after Maya and Chloe went to bed, Dad explained. We tried not to argue in front of them about bills or my unemployment. We wanted to maintain a sense of normalcy. Maya, Sarah turned to me, did you feel shielded from your parents' financial stress? I almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. No, kids aren't stupid and our house isn't that big. I heard the late-night conversations, saw the stack of overdue notices on Dad's desk, noticed when we suddenly started buying generic everything at the grocery store. The shielding just meant I wasn't allowed to acknowledge what was happening or offer to help. So you found other ways to help, Sarah observed. I found ways to be less of a burden, I corrected. There's a difference. Sarah made notes on her legal pad, her pen scratching softly against the paper. Maya, when did you first notice the connection between your insulin needs and your family's financial stress? The question required me to think back to the beginning, to trace the slow evolution from responsible diabetes management to disordered eating. Maybe 18 months ago? Dad had been out of work for about 3 months, and I overheard him on the phone with the insurance company about my prescription coverage. He was asking about generic alternatives, about increasing my deductible to lower the monthly premiums, about whether there were any diabetes medications that cost less than insulin. I could see the memory hitting my parents like a physical blow, recognition dawning in their faces. The insurance rep told him that insulin is insulin. There's no generic alternative to type 1 diabetes, no cheaper option that would keep me alive. After that call, Dad sat in his car in our driveway for an hour. I watched him from my bedroom window, just sitting there with his head in his hands. How did that make you feel? Sarah asked. Guilty. Like my existence was a financial burden my family couldn't afford. Like, maybe if I was better at managing my condition, if I needed less insulin, if I could be less expensive to keep alive, then Dad wouldn't have to sit in his car crying about prescription costs. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition and regret. Dad's face had gone pale again, his hands clenched into fists on the conference table. Maya, he said, his voice rough with emotion, I never wanted you to feel that way. Never. You are not a burden. You're my daughter, and I would give anything, sell anything, sacrifice anything to keep you healthy and safe. I know that now, but when you're 12 or 13 or 14 years old and you're already dealing with a chronic illness that makes you different from your friends, and you can see that your medical needs are causing your parents stress, it's easy to start thinking that maybe if you could just need a little less, be a little less complicated, everyone would be happier.
Sarah nodded, making more notes. Maya developed what we call hypervigilance around her impact on family resources. She began monitoring not just her blood sugar, but her parents' emotional and financial state, and modifying her behavior to minimize her perceived burden. She turned to Chloe. How did this dynamic affect you? My sister had been quiet throughout most of the session, but now she looked up with an expression that was part guilt, part confusion. I guess I got to be the normal kid. Like, I never had to think about whether my needs were too expensive or whether asking for things would stress out Mom and Dad. Maya was already carrying that worry for both of us. The observation was painfully accurate. Somewhere along the way, I'd appointed myself the family's designated worrier, the child who monitored the emotional temperature of our household and adjusted accordingly. Chloe had been free to be a normal teenager because I'd taken on the role of hyper-responsible caretaker.
This is a common pattern in families dealing with chronic illness and financial stress, Sarah explained. One child becomes the patient and the other becomes the healthy one, but both roles come with their own burdens and limitations. We spent the next hour discussing communication patterns, financial transparency appropriate for teenagers, and the difference between age-appropriate responsibility and parentification. Sarah gave my parents homework assignments, books to read about diabetes and eating disorders, communication exercises to practice, and a schedule of family therapy sessions that would continue throughout my treatment. As we prepared to leave, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. Maya, I want you to know that what you did, the insulin rationing, the food restriction, it was a logical response to an impossible situation. Your brain found a way to solve an unsolvable problem, and for a while it worked. But now your body is paying the price, and we need to teach you healthier ways to cope with stress and uncertainty. What if I can't? The question that had been haunting me all weekend finally escaped. What if I've been doing this for so long that I don't know how to eat normally anymore? What if I get to Willowbrook and realize I actually do have an eating disorder, not just diabetes management gone wrong? Sarah's smile was kind but realistic. Then we'll treat the eating disorder, along with everything else. Maya, recovery isn't about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about being willing to do the hard work of healing, even when you're not sure what that healing will look like. Sunday was Chloe's revised birthday celebration, and despite everything that had happened, my parents were determined to make it special. We hung fairy lights in the backyard, ordered pizza from her favorite place, and invited 3 of her closest friends over for what she dubbed a small but mighty Sweet 16. Watching her blow out candles on a grocery store cake while surrounded by people who loved her, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Relief at not having to calculate carbohydrates or worry about insulin ratios or monitor anyone's stress levels. For one evening, I was just Maya, not Maya with diabetes, or Maya the responsible one, or Maya who costs too much money. "Make a wish," her friend Emma called out, and Chloe closed her eyes for a long moment before blowing out all 16 candles in one breath. Later, as we cleaned up paper plates and leftover pizza, she told me what she'd wished for. "I wished for you to get better," she said simply. "Not just the eating thing, but all of it. I wished for you to remember that you're allowed to take up space, to need things, to be a regular teenager who doesn't have to save everyone else from worry." The wish was so perfectly Chloe, generous, insightful, and completely focused on someone else, even on her own birthday, that I had to excuse myself to cry in the bathroom for a few minutes. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that seems designed for difficult transitions. My suitcase sat by the front door, packed with the strange assortment of items that would constitute my life for the next month or more. Soft clothes without metal hardware, books without triggering content, family photos that had been approved by the treatment team.
The drive to Willowbrook took 43 minutes, most of which passed in nervous silence. Dad had taken the day off work. His new supervisor continued to be understanding about family medical emergencies, and Mom had arranged for coverage at the hotel. Even Chloe had gotten permission to miss her morning classes to be part of the intake process. Willowbrook Treatment Center looked nothing like the psychiatric hospitals I'd imagined from movies and television. It was a converted Victorian mansion surrounded by gardens, with large windows and comfortable seating areas that suggested healing rather than confinement. The intake coordinator, a woman named Janet with graying hair and laugh lines, greeted us at the front desk with the kind of warmth usually reserved for welcomed guests rather than incoming patients. "You must be Maya," she said, extending her hand for a shake rather than immediately launching into paperwork and procedures. "I'm Janet, and I'll be coordinating your treatment team. Dr. Martinez has told us quite a bit about your situation, and we're honored that you're trusting us to be part of your recovery journey." The language of recovery and healing, rather than sickness and treatment, felt foreign but somehow comforting. This wasn't a place where I'd be fixed because I was broken. It was a place where I'd learn new skills because the old ones had stopped working. The intake process took most of the morning. Medical examinations, psychological assessments, meal planning consultations, and what felt like hundreds of forms documenting everything from my insulin requirements to my family dynamics. Through it all, my parents stayed close, asking questions and taking notes like they were cramming for the most important test of their lives. Maya will have a private room initially, Janet explained as we toured the residential wing. As she progresses in treatment, she may choose to have a roommate, but for now, we want to give her space to adjust to our environment and routines. My room was small but comfortable, with a single bed, a desk, a dresser, and a window that looked out onto the gardens. It felt simultaneously like a college dorm room and a high-end hotel. Institutional but not sterile, temporary but not unwelcoming. Visiting hours are Wednesday evenings and weekend afternoons. Family therapy sessions will be scheduled based on Maya's treatment plan, and we encourage regular communication through phone calls and supervised video calls. The reality of being separated from my family for weeks, possibly months, finally hit me as we stood in that small room surrounded by my hastily packed belongings. For 2 years, I'd been hyper-vigilant about their emotional state, monitoring their stress levels and adjusting my behavior accordingly. Now, I'd be 43 minutes away, unable to check on them or modify my needs based on their capacity to handle them. What if something happens at home while I'm here? What if Dad loses his job again, or Mom gets sick, or Chloe needs help with something? Then we'll handle it, Dad said firmly. Maya, for too long, we've made you feel responsible for managing our family's problems. That stops now. Your job is to focus on getting better, and our job is to learn how to be a family that doesn't require you to sacrifice your health for our peace of mind. The goodbye was harder than I anticipated. Mom cried, which made Chloe cry, which made me cry, and even Dad's eyes looked suspiciously bright as he hugged me one final time. "We love you," Mom whispered against my hair. "More than any party, more than any job, more than anything. And we're going to do whatever it takes to make sure you never doubt that again."
After they left, I sat on the narrow bed in my temporary room and looked around at the space that would be my home for the foreseeable future. On the desk, someone had left a welcome packet with my daily schedule: medical consultations, individual therapy, group sessions, meal supervision, and something called family dynamics processing that sounded simultaneously promising and terrifying. At the bottom of the welcome packet was a handwritten note from Jordan Martinez. "Maya, recovery is not a destination. It's a daily choice to choose healing over survival, connection over control, and trust over fear. You've already taken the hardest step by walking through these doors. Everything else is just learning new skills to replace the ones that stopped serving you. We're honored to be part of your journey. Sarah." That first evening, I called home using the supervised phone system, talking to my parents and Chloe for 15 minutes about anything except treatment or eating disorders or diabetes management. We discussed Chloe's chemistry test, Mom's new work schedule now that Dad was employed again, and Dad's plans to finally fix the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom that had been driving Mom crazy for months. Normal family conversations about normal family concerns, the kind of interactions I'd been too anxious to enjoy for far too long. After the call, I sat in the common area with 3 other residents, playing a board game and learning about their stories. Jessica was recovering from anorexia, triggered by competitive gymnastics. Marcus was working through binge eating disorder that had developed after his parents' divorce. Aisha was addressing exercise addiction that had masked her anxiety about starting college. All of us had started with logical responses to difficult situations. All of us had found coping mechanisms that worked until they didn't. All of us were learning that recovery meant developing new tools rather than simply abandoning the old ones. As I prepared for bed that first night, I realized something that surprised me. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't calculating insulin ratios or monitoring my family's stress levels or planning how to be less of a burden. I was just Maya, in a safe place, surrounded by people whose job it was to help me remember that I deserved to take up space in the world.
The legacy of my insulin crisis, the recognition that love alone wasn't enough to manage chronic illness, that financial stress required honest communication rather than protective silence, that children shouldn't have to choose between their health and their family's peace of mind, would reshape our family forever. But as I drifted off to sleep in that unfamiliar bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope that healing was possible, and trust that I wouldn't have to do it alone. 18 months later. The morning of my high school graduation dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect June day that seems specifically designed for milestone celebrations. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the cap and gown that had seemed like an impossible dream during those dark weeks at Willowbrook Treatment Center, and marveled at how different the girl looking back at me was from the one who had nearly died from insulin rationing just over a year ago. My reflection showed healthy color in my cheeks, bright eyes that no longer carried the constant calculation of carbohydrate ratios and insulin doses, and a body that had learned to trust that food was fuel rather than a luxury I couldn't afford. The glucose monitor clipped to my waistband read 127, perfectly normal, maintained through proper medication management and regular meals, rather than starvation and mathematical desperation. "Maya, Jordan's here." Chloe's voice carried up the stairs, accompanied by the sound of her combat boots thundering across the hardwood floor. At 16, my sister had grown into her confidence in ways that still amazed me. No longer the worry-free child who had been shielded from family stress, but a young woman who understood that being part of a family meant sharing both burdens and celebrations. I grabbed my cap and gown and headed downstairs where Jordan was waiting in the living room, looking surprisingly formal in his rented tuxedo. He'd been accepted to the University of Colorado for pre-med, inspired partly by his experience helping me through my diabetes crisis senior year. We'd maintained our friendship through our treatment and recovery, and he'd become something like a brother to our entire family.
"Ready for the big day, college girl?" he asked, grinning as he pinned a small corsage to my graduation gown. The flowers were white roses. Simple, elegant, and completely without the mathematical anxiety that had once accompanied any celebration in our house. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied, which was both true and complicated. In the fall, I'd be starting at the State University with a full scholarship, majoring in public health with a focus on healthcare accessibility, a career path that had emerged directly from my own experience with medical rationing and eating disorder recovery. Dad appeared from the kitchen, camera in hand, and pride written across every line of his face. The past 18 months had aged him in some ways. The gray at his temples was more pronounced, and the lines around his eyes spoke to the stress of nearly losing a child to his own financial choices. But there was also a lightness about him that hadn't existed before, a freedom from the hypervigilant worry that had characterized our family dynamic for so long. "My daughter, the college graduate," he said, though technically I was just graduating from high school. The slip revealed how much hope he was investing in this moment, how much this day represented not just my academic achievement, but our family's survival and recovery. "High school graduate, Dad," I corrected gently. "College comes next." "Right, but still." He raised the camera and began documenting everything with the enthusiasm of a man who had learned not to take family milestones for granted. "Mom's in the car warming it up. She didn't want to be late for the processional." The drive to school took us past familiar landmarks that had marked the geography of my adolescence. The park where I'd learned to check my blood sugar discreetly, the pharmacy where I'd experienced so much anxiety about prescription costs, the doctor's office where Dr. Reeves had delivered the news that changed everything. Now these places held different meanings, markers of growth rather than sources of stress. At the school, families gathered on the football field in a chaos of folding chairs, congratulatory flowers, and nervous energy. I found my assigned place in the alphabetical lineup of graduates between Tommy Capman and David Clark, both of whom had been in my calculus class the day I'd nearly collapsed from hypoglycemia. "Maya!" Tommy turned around as we waited for the processional to begin. "I heard you're going into public health. That's so cool. You're going to help fix the healthcare system from the inside." The comment was casual, throwaway, but it reminded me how much my experience had become part of who I was, rather than something I was ashamed of or trying to hide. During my treatment at Willowbrook, I'd learned to talk openly about diabetes management,
eating disorder recovery, and the intersection of chronic illness with socioeconomic stress. What had once been sources of shame had become platforms for advocacy. "That's the plan," I replied. "Someone needs to figure out why a $40 copay can become a life or death choice for a middle-class family with insurance." The processional music began, and we filed onto the football field in our caps and gowns, a sea of 18-year-olds transitioning from one phase of life to another. As I walked across the grass, I spotted my family in the stands, Mom with her camera, Dad with his proud smile, and Chloe waving enthusiastically despite the fact that graduation ceremony etiquette probably discouraged such displays. Also in the stands, in a section I hadn't expected, sat Dr. Reeves and Sarah Martinez from Willowbrook. They'd both played crucial roles in my recovery, and seeing them there, professional women who had taken time from their busy schedules to witness this milestone, filled me with a gratitude so profound I had to blink back tears. Principal Henderson's commencement speech focused on resilience, on the graduating class's ability to overcome challenges and emerge stronger. As I listened to his words on perseverance and growth, I thought about how different my understanding of resilience had become over the past 18 months. I'd once thought resilience meant enduring silently, managing alone, sacrificing my needs to avoid burdening others. Now I understood that true resilience meant asking for help, accepting support, and recognizing that survival wasn't the same as thriving. It meant learning to live with chronic illness in ways that honored both my medical needs and my humanity. When my name was called, Maya Elizabeth Chen, I walked across the stage with steady steps, shook Principal Henderson's hand, and received my diploma with the knowledge that I'd earned it, not just through academic work, but through the harder curriculum of learning to value my own life. The celebration continued at home, where Mom had prepared a feast that represented everything our family had learned about food, love, and abundance. The table groaned under the weight of my favorite dishes: pad thai from the restaurant where we'd celebrated my acceptance to college, homemade chocolate cake that Chloe had insisted on baking herself, and a spread of appetizers that reflected our family's journey toward healthier communication around food and celebration. For the first time in years, I ate without calculation, without anxiety, without the background mental mathematics that had once turned every meal into an equation of insulin and carbohydrates and family financial stress. The food was simply food. Nourishment and celebration and love made tangible. "I have something for you," Dad said as we cleared the dinner dishes, producing a small wrapped box from his pocket. "I wanted to wait until after graduation to give this to you." Inside the box was a medical alert bracelet, but not the utilitarian piece of metal I'd worn since my diabetes diagnosis. This one was beautiful. Sterling silver with delicate engraving that read Type 1 diabetic on one side and worth every penny on the other. The inscription made me laugh and cry simultaneously. It was Dad's way of acknowledging our past while affirming my future. A promise that my medical needs would never again be weighed against family finances or anyone else's convenience. "It's perfect," I said, fastening the bracelet around my wrist next to the simple watch I'd received as a graduation gift from my grandparents. "I'll wear it every day." "There's something else," Mom added, her voice carrying the nervous excitement that accompanied significant announcements. "We've been working with Dr. Reeves and the diabetes advocacy group she connected us with. We want to start a scholarship fund for teenagers with chronic illnesses who are dealing with medication rationing." The idea took my breath away. Turning our family's crisis into a resource for other families, creating something positive from our darkest moments, felt like the most meaningful legacy we could build from my experience. "We want to call it the Maya Chen Fund for Medical Access," Dad continued, "but only if you're comfortable with that. We know you've been through enough public scrutiny."
"I've been thinking about what I want to study in college," she said, carefully arranging plates in the rack. "Maybe psychology or social work, something that helps families communicate better." The career choice didn't surprise me. Chloe had attended several family therapy sessions during my treatment, and the experience had opened her eyes to the dynamics she'd never fully understood as the healthy child in our family. "That sounds perfect for you," I said. "You've always been good at reading people's emotions and helping them feel heard. I learned from watching you. Even when you were struggling, even when you were literally starving yourself, you were still trying to take care of everyone else. I want to help families before they get to that point. Later that evening, after Jordan had gone home and our extended family had finished their congratulatory phone calls, I sat in my room reviewing the acceptance packet from the university. My schedule for fall semester included Introduction to Public Health, Statistics, Biology, and a seminar called Healthcare Policy and Social Justice, courses that would prepare me for a career addressing the systemic issues that had nearly killed me. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica, my roommate from Willowbrook, who is now thriving in her freshman year at a college in California. "Saw your graduation pics on Instagram! So proud of you! Remember when we thought recovery was impossible? Look at us now, changing the world one healthy choice at a time." The message reminded me of those early days in treatment, when recovery had felt like an abstract concept rather than a realistic goal. I'd been so accustomed to survival mode, to the hypervigilance and calculation that had kept me alive, that learning to simply live, to eat regular meals, to trust my family with my needs, to believe I deserved space and resources, had felt revolutionary. Now, 18 months later, recovery wasn't something I was working toward. It was something I was living, day by day, meal by meal, honest conversation by honest conversation. A soft knock on my door interrupted my reflection. "Maya, can I come in?" Mom's voice carried the gentle uncertainty that had characterized our relationship since my treatment. She'd learned to ask permission, to respect boundaries, to communicate directly rather than through the protective silence that once defined our family. "Of course," I said, closing my laptop and turning to face her. She settled into my desk chair, looking around my room with the wonder of a parent who had nearly lost her child and been given a second chance. "I wanted to talk to you about something before you leave for college in the fall." "What's on your mind?" "Dr. Reeves called yesterday with an update about your insurance situation." The mention of insurance still carried weight in our house, though now it was discussed openly rather than in whispered conversations after bedtime. "The investigation into medication noncompliance has been officially closed. Your coverage is secure, and there won't be any penalties or restrictions on your diabetes supplies." The relief I felt was profound, though I'd tried not to worry about the insurance situation during my recovery. The investigation had been one more layer of stress, the possibility that my attempt to manage impossible circumstances might result in losing medical coverage altogether. "That's wonderful news," I said. "What changed their minds?" Dr. Reeves submitted a comprehensive report about medical rationing among teenagers with chronic illness. "Apparently, your case wasn't unique. Lots of kids have been making dangerous choices about medication compliance because of financial stress. The insurance company decided it was better to address the underlying accessibility issues rather than punish individual families." The revelation that my experience was part of a larger pattern was both comforting and horrifying. Comforting because it meant that I hadn't been uniquely terrible at managing my condition. Horrifying because it meant that other families were facing similar impossible choices. "Is that part of why you and Dad want to start the scholarship fund?" I asked. "Partly," she admitted, "but mostly we want to do it because we failed you, and we want to make sure other families have resources we didn't know existed. We want to turn our biggest mistake into something that helps other people avoid the same crisis." I reached for her hand, understanding now how much courage it took for my parents to publicly acknowledge their role in my medical emergency. Starting a scholarship fund meant talking openly about their choice, about the night they prioritized a party over insulin, about the daughter who nearly died rather than ask for help. "Mom, you didn't fail me. The system failed all of us. Insurance companies that make medication unaffordable, employers that don't provide living wages, a healthcare system that treats chronic illness like a luxury rather than a basic human need. You and Dad did the best you could with impossible choices." "We should have asked for help sooner," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 18 months of therapy and self-reflection. "We should have been honest with you and Chloe about our financial stress instead of trying to protect you from adult concerns. We should have prioritized your medical needs over our pride. And I should have told you I was rationing insulin instead of trying to manage everything alone.
We all made choices based on love and fear and incomplete information. The important thing is that we learn from them. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, mother and daughter who had learned to communicate honestly rather than protectively. Through my window, I could see the neighborhood settling into evening. Porch lights coming on, families gathering in living rooms, the ordinary magic of people who had homes and health and each other. Maya, Mom said finally, I need you to know something before you leave for college. You are not a burden. You never were a burden. Your diabetes, your medication needs, your medical expenses, none of that makes you less valuable or less deserving of resources. You are our daughter, and we will always choose your health over everything else. The words I'd needed to hear for years finally spoken aloud without qualification or condition. I felt something inside me settle, a deep recognition that I was allowed to take up space, to need things, to cost money without apologizing for my existence. Thank you, I said simply, for saying that and for meaning it, and for doing the work to become the kind of parents who could say it honestly. 3 months later, I stood in my dorm room at the university, hanging pictures and arranging the medical supplies that would keep me healthy through my freshman year. My roommate, Elena, was a pre-nursing student who had specifically requested to live with someone who had medical needs. Her younger brother had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes the previous year, and she wanted to learn more about supporting people with chronic illness. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd gone from hiding my condition to living with someone who saw it as an opportunity for education and advocacy. Recovery had transformed my diabetes from a source of shame into a platform for connection and change.
The Chen Family Fund for Medical Access had awarded its first scholarships in August. 5 teenagers dealing with chronic illness who were starting college despite medication rationing, family financial stress, or eating disorders secondary to medical management. Each scholarship recipient would receive not just financial assistance, but mentorship from healthcare professionals and peer support from others who understood the intersection of chronic illness and socioeconomic stress. Reading their application essays had been both heartbreaking and inspiring. A 17-year-old with juvenile arthritis who had been skipping doses of methotrexate because her single mother couldn't afford the copays. A 16-year-old with celiac disease whose family couldn't afford gluten-free food, leading to nutritional deficiencies and academic struggles. A 15-year-old with asthma whose family rationed his inhaler during his father's unemployment, resulting in 2 emergency room visits. My story multiplied across hundreds of families, each making impossible choices between health and financial survival. But also stories of resilience, of young people who refused to let chronic illness define their limitations, who were determined to use their experiences to create change. The scholarship recipients were planning careers in medicine, public health, social work, and healthcare policy, a generation of advocates shaped by their own medical crises. As I arranged my textbooks on the small desk in my dorm room, my phone rang with a call from Dr. Reeves. "Maya, how's your first week of college going?" "Really well," I replied, settling into my desk chair and looking out at the campus quad where students were gathering for an evening study session. "My professor seemed great, my roommate is wonderful, and I'm excited about my volunteer work at the health center." "I have some news that I think you'll find interesting," she said, her voice carrying the excitement she reserved for professional breakthroughs. "I've been invited to present a paper about medical rationing among adolescents with chronic illness at the National Diabetes Conference in December. Your case study will be the centerpiece of the presentation." The idea of my medical crisis being discussed at a national conference felt surreal, but also important.
If sharing my story could help other healthcare providers recognize the signs of medication rationing, if it could lead to better resources for families facing financial stress, then the years of secrecy and struggle would have served a purpose beyond my own survival. What kind of impact do you think the presentation might have? I asked. Policy changes, hopefully, better screening protocols for financial distress, improved assistance programs, and maybe most importantly, training for healthcare providers about how to have honest conversations with families about medication costs and accessibility. After we hung up, I sat in my dorm room thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought me from insulin rationing to college activism. The girl who had nearly died rather than ask for help was becoming a woman whose career would be built on helping others ask for help more effectively. My evening routine now included checking my blood sugar, 142, perfectly normal, and taking my insulin without anxiety, without calculation, without the fear that I was using resources my family couldn't afford. The prescription bottles in my mini fridge were full, paid for through a combination of Dad's improved insurance coverage and a patient assistance program that Dr. Reeves had helped us navigate.
Before bed, I called home to check in with my family. Not from hypervigilant worry, but from genuine connection and love. Dad was thriving in his supervisor role at Harrison Manufacturing. Mom had been promoted to assistant manager at the hotel. And Chloe was planning her own college applications with the confidence of a young woman who understood that her dreams were worthy of pursuit and investment. "How's the campus health center volunteer work going?" Chloe asked during our call. "Are you helping lots of students figure out their insurance?" "More than I expected," I replied. Apparently, medication rationing is pretty common among college students. Lots of people are trying to stretch prescriptions or skipping doses to save money for tuition or living expenses. "That's so scary," she said, "but also kind of amazing that you're there to help them avoid what happened to you." The conversation reminded me of something Sarah Martinez had told me during one of our last therapy sessions at Willowbrook. Recovery isn't just about healing yourself. It's about using your experience to prevent others from falling into the same patterns of survival that nearly destroyed you. At the time, the concept of using my eating disorder and medical crisis as tools for helping others had felt abstract, theoretical. Now, as I prepared for my second week of college classes and volunteer work, I could see how my experience was becoming a bridge to connect with other students facing similar impossible choices. 6 months later, I stood in a conference room at the state capitol testifying before a legislative committee about a bill that would expand prescription assistance programs for families dealing with chronic illness. My testimony was part of a broader advocacy effort led by the Diabetes Foundation that Dr. Reeves had connected our family with. But my role was to provide the personal perspective that made policy discussions real and urgent. My name is Maya Chen, and I'm a freshman at the State University studying public health. I began, my voice steady despite the gravity of sharing my story in such a formal setting. 2 years ago, I was 17 years old and slowly starving myself because my family couldn't afford both my insulin prescription and my sister's birthday party. The committee members, mostly middle-aged legislators who probably thought they understood healthcare policy, leaned forward with expressions that suggested my testimony was providing a perspective they hadn't considered. I told them about the insulin rationing, the food restriction, the hospitalizations that could have been prevented with better financial support systems. I explained how a $40 copay had nearly cost my life, how insurance investigations added trauma to medical crisis, and how families like mine were making impossible choices between health and financial survival every single day. The bill before you today would expand prescription assistance programs to include middle-class families who earn too much to qualify for traditional aid, but not enough to comfortably afford medications that keep their children alive. It would prevent other teenagers from making the choice I made between being a financial burden and being healthy. When I finished my testimony, the committee chair, an older woman who had introduced herself as a grandmother of 6,
asked a question that surprised me with its directness. Miss Chen, what would you say to parents who are currently facing the same choice your family faced? How would you advise them to prioritize when resources are limited? The question forced me to articulate something I'd learned through therapy, recovery, and 18 months of healing. I would tell them that children's medical needs are never luxuries, never optional, never something that should be negotiated against other family expenses. I would tell them to ask for help before the crisis becomes life-threatening, and I would tell them that there are people and organizations who want to help, but only if they know help is needed. The bill passed committee by a unanimous vote, moving forward to the full legislature with bipartisan support. Walking out of the Capitol building that day, I felt the profound satisfaction of turning personal trauma into systemic change, of using my voice to prevent other families from facing the impossible choices that had nearly destroyed mine. That evening, I called Dr. Reeves to share the news about the committee vote. Maya, I am so incredibly proud of you. Do you realize what you've accomplished? You've taken your medical crisis and transformed it into advocacy that could help thousands of families.
It feels good to turn something so terrible into something useful, I replied. But I also know that none of this would have been possible without the treatment I received, without my family's commitment to changing, without all the people who helped us learn how to communicate honestly about medical needs and financial stress. Recovery is rarely a solo journey, she agreed. But you've done the work, Maya. You've learned to value your own life, to ask for help when you need it, and to use your experience as a bridge to help others. That's not just recovery, that's transformation. As my freshman year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me from insulin rationing to legislative advocacy. The girl who had nearly died from hyperglycemia and malnutrition was becoming a woman whose career would be built on addressing the systemic issues that had created her crisis. My final project for healthcare policy and social justice was a research paper examining the relationship between chronic illness, eating disorders, and socioeconomic stress among teenagers. The paper synthesized academic research with personal experience, policy analysis with human stories, statistical data with the lived reality of families making impossible choices. The professor, Dr. Williams, called it exceptional work that demonstrates both analytical rigor and authentic voice. Feedback that suggested my lived experience was becoming a legitimate form of expertise, rather than simply something I had survived. More importantly, the paper had attracted attention from researchers at the medical school who invited me to present my findings at their annual symposium on adolescent health. The girl who had once hidden her medical needs was becoming a young woman whose medical experience was recognized as valuable knowledge. On the last day of my freshman year, I packed up my dorm room with a sense of completion that went beyond academic achievement. The year had been about more than earning good grades or making friends or adjusting to college life. It had been about integrating my recovery with my identity, my medical history with my future goals, my personal trauma with my professional aspirations. Elena, my roommate, had become one of my closest friends and a fierce advocate for diabetes awareness on campus. Her brother's diagnosis had given her family insights that mine had lacked. They'd immediately connected with support groups, applied for assistance programs, and established open communication about medical needs and family resources. I keep thinking about how different things might have been if your family had known about all these resources when you were first diagnosed. Like if someone had just handed your parents a list of assistance programs and support groups. If there had been better screening for financial distress. If healthcare providers had been trained to recognize medication rationing. The observation captured something important about my experience. It hadn't been a failure of love or character or family commitment, but a failure of systems and information and support networks.
My parents had loved me enough to sacrifice anything for my health, but they hadn't known what resources were available or how to access them effectively. That summer, I worked as an intern with the Diabetes Foundation, helping to develop educational materials for newly diagnosed families and training healthcare providers to screen for financial distress and medication rationing. The work felt like completion, taking everything I'd learned from crisis, treatment, and recovery and transforming it into resources that could prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma.
My parents had become advocates themselves, speaking at support group meetings and sharing their story with other families facing financial stress and chronic illness. Dad had overcome his initial reluctance to discuss our experience publicly, recognizing that their transparency could help other parents avoid the choice that had nearly cost them their daughter. "We made a terrible mistake," he would tell other families, "but we made it out of love and desperation and incomplete information. The important thing is that we learned from it, and that we're working to make sure other families have better options." Mom had become particularly effective at connecting with mothers who were struggling to balance medical needs with family finances. Her ability to acknowledge mistakes without drowning in guilt, to accept help without losing dignity, made her an invaluable peer mentor for other parents navigating similar challenges. Chloe, now a junior in high school, had become a volunteer with the Youth Advocacy Program, sharing her perspective as the sibling of someone with chronic illness. Her insight that children and families dealing with medical stress often take on inappropriate responsibilities, either hypervigilant caregiving like I had, or guilt-free normalcy like she had, was helping other families distribute emotional labor more equitably. As I prepared to return to campus for my sophomore year, I realized that my insulin crisis had become the foundation for everything meaningful in my life: my career path, my advocacy work, my family's improved communication, my understanding of resilience and recovery, and the difference between surviving and thriving. The girl who had nearly died rather than ask for help had become a woman whose life was dedicated to making it easier for others to ask for help effectively. The family that had almost been destroyed by secrecy and financial stress had become advocates for transparency and systemic change. Dr. Reeves had been right when she said that love wasn't enough to treat diabetes. Insulin was required, and insulin required resources. And resources required systems that made life-saving medication accessible to everyone who needed it. But she'd also been right about something else. Recovery was possible, transformation was achievable, and crisis could become the catalyst for meaningful change.
Standing in my childhood bedroom, packing for my second year of college, I looked at the medical alert bracelet Dad had given me for graduation. Worth every penny caught the light, a daily reminder that my life had value, that my needs were legitimate, that asking for help was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. The insulin vials in my mini cooler were full, my blood sugar was stable, my family was healthy and honest and whole. The crisis that had nearly destroyed us had become the foundation for everything we'd built since. Stronger relationships, clearer communication, and a shared commitment to using our experience to help others avoid similar trauma. Recovery hadn't meant returning to who I was before the crisis. It had meant becoming someone entirely new, someone who understood that healing was possible, that families could change, and that even the most devastating experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and service. As I loaded my car for the drive back to campus, I realized that my story was no longer just about survival. It was about transformation, advocacy, and the radical act of turning personal trauma into systemic change. The girl who had rationed insulin to avoid burdening her family had become a woman whose life was dedicated to ensuring that no other family would face such an impossible choice.
The legacy of my crisis wasn't shame or secrecy or the fear of taking up too much space. It was the understanding that everyone deserves access to life-saving medication, that families dealing with chronic illness need support rather than judgment, and that recovery is always possible when people are willing to do the difficult work of change. Dr. Reeves' words had made my parents turn white with recognition of how close they'd come to losing me. But that recognition had become the foundation for healing, growth, and a commitment to making sure that no other family would have to choose between a child's health and financial survival. My name is Maya Chen. I am a survivor, an advocate, and a college student studying public health. I am also a daughter, a sister, and a person with type 1 diabetes who has learned that asking for help is not a burden, but a gift, both to yourself and to the people who love you enough to provide it. This is my story. It's a story of crisis and recovery, of family secrets and healing transparency, of nearly dying and choosing to live fully. If Maya's journey has touched you, please take a moment to like the story, share it with others who might benefit, and subscribe for more real stories that matter. Your engagement helps these important stories reach the families who need them most. Most importantly, it's a story of transformation, how the worst thing that ever happened to my family became the foundation for everything meaningful we've built since.